All right, good morning. Good morning, and good afternoon to some of you, depending on where you are. We are so happy that you have been able to join us today for our very special guest. So today we have Dr. Eddie Cole joining us. Dr. Cole is an associate professor of higher education and organizational change at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's also researching college presidents. He's looking at the historical role that shapes racial policies and practices. Eddie looks at both inside and outside of educational spheres. And as a scholar of higher education, particularly higher ed history, Dr. Cole's approach has been, how do we uncover historical material and make connections to the current and the critical context with respect to the academy? He looks at activism within and beyond the academy and finesses through the use of extensive historical methods and materials to address contemporary racial issues in higher education. Also of note is he is the author of The Campus Color Line, College Presidents and the Struggle for Black Freedom. This is with Princeton University Press. The Campus Color Line has received much praise from the nation's leading literary review journals, such as Kirkus Reviews. This book has been called Intensely Researched Narratives that explore the silent networks of Black college presidents whose efforts have slipped under the radar, while the Library Journal has assessed that it is extensively researched, well-written examinations of racism, integration, and violence in the post-secondary environment. It's a major contribution to the field of education. And so without further ado, it is my pleasure and a distinct honor on behalf of our Dean, James Anderson, the College of Education, and co-sponsored by the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, to bring to you Dr. Eddie Cole for our distinguished lecture.
Good morning, good morning, good morning to the Illinois family, but also let me say good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, or good evening. And I know some people in the UK are watching as well. So good night, potentially to you as well. Thank you for spending time with me. What an honor to join the Illinois family. Look, I can't think of a better place to talk about the history of education than with Illinois. So with that said, I want to get into my opening comments about my book, The Campus Color Line. So The Campus Color Line is a history of the Black freedom movement as seen through the actions of college presidents. And ultimately, what I argue in the book is that college presidents actively, although oftentimes quietly, shape racial policies and practices both inside and outside of the college campus. And this is notable just because of the focal period for the book lands post-World War II, so picking up in the late 1940s and works through 1960s. And this is a notable time for higher education leadership as universities take on more influence in society. And it's a critical time in leadership because of, frankly, the realism of violence in the moment. In fact, looking at this photograph in front of you, which is a picture on the cover of the book, I came across this picture in the archives at the University of Alabama as I was working through the papers of Frank Rose, who was the president there through the 1960s. And this particular photograph was sent to the president of the University of Alabama from a University of Alabama alum, class of 1939, saying that this image from the sit-ins in 1960 was an image that that alumnus was hoping would not unfold at the University of Alabama. And you see this distinctive line, right? The color line, the campus, right? Between the Black students on the right and on the left, some white students. It's a really gripping, compelling photograph, but it's an image that college presidents did not want to see on their campus. If you could imagine them looking out of the president's office. So with that said, that's what we're going to get into today. But before we get into this history of university leadership in the Black freedom movement, I actually want to start off and invite you to, let's come to present day quickly and look at some images that you may be familiar with. Some of you may have seen this one or remember it, or at least can pick up just from looking at it where it was. It's the University of Missouri in 2015, where some Black students on the football team, after a series of racial incidents on campus, threatened to boycott and not play a game in November 2015 if university leadership did not swiftly take action with regard to race. After student demands had been gone unheard for months, the students wanted the actual chancellor and president of the system to step down and resign. It's a very compelling image and a very notable moment in the recent years. What about this image? You may not have seen it, but you can also quickly pick up on it. There's the physical expansion of Temple University in North Philadelphia. One sign here saying North Philly, not Templetown, where Temple is expanding and displacing longtime residents in that part of Philadelphia. There's something to be said about this contemporary moment around university expansion. And what does that mean for working class and communities of color that live within close proximity to these campuses? Also consider this image, 2017. University of Virginia. You see the tiki torches in the background? This is probably familiar to you as well. White nationalists come to campus, and it raises long-standing questions when they came to campus around where does the line for free speech end and where does the line for hate speech begin, right? Again, this is current issues that we're dealing with, but it's not just predominantly white campuses as well, grappling with these bigger questions around race in higher education. How about this image you may remember? Welcome to the Trump plantation. Overseer Wayne A.I. Frederick. President Frederick leads Howard University in Washington, D.C., historically Black campus. So even in these recent images that we just worked through, I showed them because these are images that led to national headlines while I was doing research for this book from 2015 through 2016 through 2017. And something that I noticed while studying college presidents in the archives, working through this moment was, whether we know it or not, consciously or unconsciously, national media, faculty, students, everyone seems to turn toward the college president. From the New York Times to the Washington Post to the Chronicle of Higher Education, there are headlines about college presidents and the question of race on campus. But what I noticed as I was seeing these headlines unfold while I was in the archives is that not only were these issues not new, there are longstanding issues of race around free speech and race and historically Black colleges and governance and their relationships to elected officials, and how do university leaders respond to racial incidents, particularly as it pertains to Black students. All of these times we look toward the college president. But what I wanted to know more about was, what is the history behind college and university leaders, right? These chancellors and presidents, and how they've not just responded to racial issues. That's one thing, but notably, how have they actually worked actively to shape racial policies and practices? And so I traveled around the country and ended up going to nearly 30 colleges and universities. I can talk more about methods later, but going to nearly 30 colleges and universities, studying presidential papers, both their personal papers and their official chancellor office records, as well as local historical societies, state government archives. And what emerged were the themes that led to how the book is organized right now. And so I start the book talking about Black college presidents and their role in dismantling segregation, right? How did they challenge white supremacy in higher education? These Black presidents of Black colleges throughout the United States. And oftentimes they were doing so through hidden networks, doing this quietly in order to protect the institution and themselves, but also challenging white supremacist systems in higher education. Another theme that emerges is this relationship between the university and housing, federal housing policy, right? So what's the history of the role of presidents and chancellors in working with federal officials and shaping housing policy? And then we moved on to this question around organizational structures and hierarchy, and how just simply the structure, the organization of how universities function is a stall tactic to progress. And then I moved around to the question around segregation and desegregation in Southern universities. Think about the University of Mississippi or the University of Alabama, right? And I studied how college presidents were not only involved in the decisions around whether to admit Black students or not, but also what was their role in advancing the university beyond, say, a racial violence, like what we saw at the University of Mississippi in the fall of 1962 when James Meredith enrolled as the first Black student, or at the University of Alabama that had a dramatic desegregation but didn't have racial violence on campus in 1963, which is a complete opposite from the initial desegregation attempt in 1956 on that campus. Then I also asked questions around free speech and race, and also the origins of affirmative action, right? So the book covers some of the major topics that we still deal with today, questions that we're still grappling with in this moment, but I get into the history of it and give a better explanation for how we came to where we are right now. But for the sake of time, since I don't have all day to speak with you, we're going to have to treat this talk sort of like a Google preview, if you will. And so I'm just going to talk about chapter 2 and chapter 3 of the book. I'm going to talk about we simply cannot operate in slums, the role of the university in housing discrimination, which is so prevalent right now. And then also I'll talk about race, university systems, and bureaucratic resistance. All right, so what I'm gonna do in this conversation for the next few minutes, I'm starting in Illinois and then I'm coming to California, okay? So we're gonna make this connection personal for us today. So chapter 2 of the book, I really enjoy this quote that opens up this chapter on the university and housing discrimination, because it says, quote, "The octopus in the South has tentacles in the North. You are part of a real movement, a real civil rights movement that is taking place here." Those words were spoken by Velma Hill, who was an activist for CORE, coming out of the CORE National Office, Congress of Racial Equality, that came to a protest at the University of Chicago, the South Side of Chicago in Hyde Park in January 1962. And Velma Hill is a Black woman, this activist speaking out against university administration and what had been decades, an emphasis on decades of a tense relationship between Black Chicago on the South Side and the University of Chicago. And on the left, you see this image of U Chicago Chancellor Lawrence Kipton standing on the right, talking to Mayor Richard Daley on the left. And this really gets into a very interesting narrative around the role of the university and its relationship to its neighboring community. And so what I'm gonna first demonstrate is the role of college presidents, because this is so important here, because I want to show how these college presidents were strategically meeting and shaping housing policy. So here's something notable that was just, I think I had to take a break in the archives to step out when I was coming across this. But there's a meeting in 1957 at the University of Chicago, and that Chancellor Kipton organizes a meeting around the presidents of Harvard is there, the president of MIT, Yale, the University of Pennsylvania, and Columbia. These 6 presidents, 6 white men, come together because for the University of Chicago and Lawrence Kipton, post-World War II had actually been the opposite of growth for the University of Chicago. Those of you who are familiar with the history of higher education know that post-World War II enrollments skyrocket, right? They triple and quadruple for many campuses. New buildings go up, enrollment is booming. But for the University of Chicago, actually, by the late 40s, enrollment actually had hit a low. It was going the opposite direction. It hit the lowest point that it had since 1918, with just over 1,000 students. And this is notable because what was happening post-World War II, if you're familiar with the Great Migration, and understanding Chicago being a destination spot for many Black Americans moving from the US South and moving to cities in the Northeast and the Midwest and even out here to the West Coast. When you get to the Midwest, Chicago, Hyde Park, where the University of Chicago is located. To the south of it is the Woodlawn community, predominantly Black. And to the west of Hyde Park is Washington Park community, also predominantly Black. And as Chicago had a notable history of housing discrimination, limiting where Black people could live, the encroachment, the overcrowding from Woodlawn and Washington Park soon came into Hyde Park. And a number of white faculty and white students no longer wanted to attend the University of Chicago because it was getting too close in proximity to too much Blackness, right? And so what happens is it's a crisis for President Chancellor Kipton at the University of Chicago, and he organizes other leaders of private, wealthy, urban universities to come up with going to lobby before federal officials to shape federal housing policy. And ultimately, in return, the federal government and the Dwight Eisenhower administration goes along with supporting this effort to where federal dollars end up being poured into these universities at a 2-to-1 ratio. At the University of Chicago or Harvard or MIT put up $1, they got 2 federal dollars for that. This is a significant alteration to the Federal Housing Act coming through 1949 and 1954, and then later in 1959. This is significant. And the strategy behind it ends up being using the media to show how higher education, institutions of higher education, colleges and universities are saving American cities from itself. And by saving, you mean really halting the influx of Black residents getting too close to white areas. And this letter in the archives that I came across here shows how the University of Chicago officials actively sought for publicity using the media profile, national media outlets, to frame what they were doing as progressive, right? This is the liberal university, which isn't, University of Chicago and many other Midwestern universities compared themselves to Southern institutions because, look, they had some Black students. The University of Chicago had a Carter G. Woodson as a student, right? A Benjamin Mays, right? A Georgiana Rose Simpson, right? So these notable figures had studied coming through the University of Chicago. But at the same time, the university officials did not want to be too close to these Black areas. And so you see all of a sudden headlines in the New York Times featuring the University of Chicago, headlines in US News and World Report featuring the University of Chicago. You see this letter here from the Director of Public Relations at the University of Chicago writing to NBC News, suggesting that NBC News do a feature story on the University of Chicago because of what it is doing to save blight from American cities. And it also mentions how other universities have joined in this effort. Columbia is mentioned. Philadelphia, also University of Pennsylvania, West Philadelphia is mentioned. And then dozens of other universities do the same thing along the way. Now, this is notable in that when you're focused on sort of mainstream media and how the University of Chicago was getting publicity and getting so much federal money, and also going down to Springfield and lobbying to state officials and going to the mayor's office as well and doing the same thing in Chicago, at the local, state, and federal level, you see this isn't just happenstance. These are university officials actively, strategically doing this, which in turn displaces thousands of Black households. Now, something notable is that the Urban League in 1958, Chicago, actually issued a report. And Nathaniel Calloway, who was the president of the Urban League in Chicago, a Black man, a Black doctor, actually notes that it's not that Black people were opposed to what ultimately became called urban renewal, the informal name for the federal program with these federal dollars were earmarked for saving blight in cities. It's not that people were opposed to it, but the issue was these officials were not working to challenge and dismantle the many ways that housing discrimination existed, right? And so you can't displace thousands of Black households without also stopping housing discrimination that limited where those Black families could go in the first place. But the University of Chicago was perpetuating that until we get into the early 1960s. And this is this sort of, which was fun about the work from a national standpoint, because it gave me an opportunity to also see other institutions and see the connectedness across regional boundaries. And so after 1960, you get to a point to where you see a number of students in the Midwest, in the Northeast, and on the West Coast have this awakening as they see their contemporaries, Black students at Black colleges in the US South, participating in the sit-ins and participating in the freedom rides. And all of a sudden, they turn an eye toward their local issues in a much different way. And so you see University of Chicago students by 1961 actively start protesting and actually hold a sit-in in the president's office because of the hypocrisy, as you see in this letter to the editor, of the Northern liberal universities, such as the University of Chicago. And so you see this 3-week protest happens at the University of Chicago. They changed from Chancellor Kipton to having George Beadle become the president now. And George Beadle actually leaves campus during this time frame and goes to California to give a speech, a fundraising speech. And University of California, Berkeley students meet University of Chicago president in San Francisco and protest outside of the hotel where he's speaking, right? So there's no way to get away from it. And this pressure ultimately shifts headlines away from celebrating the University of Chicago to being more critical of what these universities are doing, which is what Black residents on the South Side of Chicago have been arguing for 3-4 decades up to this point. And ultimately, this student activism pushes a change in policy. So this is a very interesting particular case. I wish I could get into more details of it, but I want to give a little snippet of that and understanding that there's questions to be grappled with about the long history of how university leaders themselves, not this sort of mythical institution, but leaders themselves have made these intentional decisions that have been harmful to Black communities near and far in proximity to their campuses. But let me leave Illinois for a second and let's go to California briefly for this part. And let's talk about chapter 3 of the book, because it talks about race, university systems, and bureaucratic resistance. This is critical as well. And I like to share this quote that opens up this chapter from Franklin D. Murphy, who at the time of this quote was the chancellor at the University of Kansas, but was incoming chancellor at UCLA. And he says, quote, "My only hesitancy in the matter came out of the question as to whether I would really have the local administrative authority and flexibility to do the kind of strong and sound administrative job that quite obviously UCLA now requires," end quote. Franklin Murphy was hesitant in taking the UCLA chancellor job because it was a little bit different from being chancellor at the University of Kansas. And that's how university systems come in place. Because at Kansas, he reported directly to the Board of Regents. But in California, as chancellor of the University of California, LA, he was actually going to report to the system president, Clark Kerr, who is a notable name in US higher education history. Clark Kerr, instead of directly to the regents. And many of the fellow contemporary academic leaders that Franklin Murphy knew at the time advised him, actually don't take the UCLA job. It's a trap. It's not actual leadership. Clark Kerr makes all the decisions as president of the system. And this image on the right captures this nicely in that when Dwight Eisenhower was given an honorary degree by the University of California, the ceremony itself was at UCLA. But down from Berkeley comes Clark Kerr, and there was a question over who would actually hand Dwight Eisenhower, the former US president, the actual honorary degree. And you see this sort of tension here. Franklin Murphy is the one in the center looking on, and Clark Kerr, the University of California president, actually hands it over. But this gets into this sort of tenseness around what does it mean to lead within the university system, and what does that mean for progress, particularly during the Black Freedom Movement. So a little bit about Franklin Murphy, who was born in Kansas, born in Kansas City, went to the University of Kansas, about 40 miles away from Kansas City, went to University of Pennsylvania for medical school, and then after a brief service for the military as a doctor, came back to the University of Kansas, and at the young age of 32, was actually named the dean of the University of Kansas Medical School. 3 years later, he was tapped to become chancellor at age 35 of the University of Kansas. Remarkably accomplished, remarkably young, leading a major research university. But, after 9 years, from 1951 to 1960, being chancellor at the University of Kansas, it was time for Franklin Murphy to leave Kansas. And this is notable because it gets into this idea of anti-intellectualism in America, because a conservative governor in Kansas actually had a lot of pushback against the University of Kansas, arguing that faculty were overpaid, arguing that Franklin Murphy as chancellor was overpaid, arguing that he was out of the state more on international trips and research trips than he was in state. And the average resident of Kansas really didn't need this fancy university. So you see budget cuts and a really ugly public debate that ultimately pushed Franklin Murphy to look elsewhere. But this led to his concern around whether he would truly have the authority to lead at UCLA. So with that said, thinking Kansas was a place where he couldn't truly grow a university, turned his attention toward UCLA. But this speech that I came across from Franklin Murphy shortly after he arrived in Los Angeles tells the story about university systems and resistance, and really this idea of progressive spaces and resistance. And the title of his speech that was given at First AME Church, which is the oldest Black church in Los Angeles, the title was Los Angeles, Its Image and Its Reality. And you can see some of the tense racial issues unfolding in LA that Franklin Murphy simply was not aware of when he was considering the UCLA job and then accepting it. And this is notable from housing discrimination and pickets in solidarity with Black Southern students and so forth. Los Angeles is a very active space during this time frame. But I also want to talk about UCLA, its image and its reality. And this really gets into this idea of university systems and how it can stall racial progress. These two images across the top are the University of California and its image, right? The New York Times called it the colossal university by the Pacific. University of California, pride of an education-conscious state, has solved the great problem of combining size with excellence. And then Clark Kerr, who I mentioned earlier, the president of the University of California system, is on the cover of Time magazine, a university president on the cover of Time magazine, talking about the California Master Plan for Higher Education in 1960, which ultimately created a tracking system across 3 college systems within the state of California, which still exists today. You got the University of California system, you've got the California State University system, you've got the California Community College system. And some phenomenal historians have looked at the impact of the master plan, which Clark Kerr was influential in shaping and pushing through and becoming part of the state policy, is that it funneled students of color, particularly Black students, away from 4-year institutions and into the 2-year college system in California. For example, Martha Biondi writes about this, and a few other historian scholars write about this, that San Francisco State in 1960 had a 12% Black student enrollment in 1960. By 1968, that percentage was down to 3. So you see how the California Master Plan and these systems are at play. And so the two images across the bottom show a little bit about the reality of UCLA, right? Franklin Murphy becomes chancellor and immediately forms an anti-discrimination committee, because local barbershops in Westwood, which is the community, the neighborhood bordering UCLA, Westwood won't cut, barbers won't serve Black students. Discrimination in the fraternity and sorority system, as well as the Kerr directives, or these strict regulations that forbid students from participating in off-campus issues under the name of the University of California. Therefore, throughout the 1950s, and I'm about to wrap this up just to bring it on home, throughout the 1950s, university administrators, before Franklin Murphy became chancellor, had denied the campus chapter of the NAACP recognition as a formal student organization, because their emphasis was involved with social issues, political issues off campus. So that did not get formal recognition and did not give them access to university facilities and so forth to meet. So with that said, I always like to bring up this point that many people at UCLA don't know, or this freedom vote that I call, that occurred in 1962 at UCLA. And this is notable because there's Franklin Murphy here walking across campus with Martin Luther King, notably, but a number of UCLA students were arrested participating in the Freedom Rides in 1961, the summer of 61. And a number of them were arrested in Jackson, Mississippi, and sent to the notorious Parchman Farm, the state penitentiary. And what happened was none of those students had to come up with bail money. They had to make bail to be released and so forth. And a number of students at UCLA were appalled by this because segregation to a number of students was immoral, and they wanted to support their fellow students who were arrested fighting for equal rights by using student government funds to bail them, to cover their bail in Mississippi, their bail funds. And it was put to a student vote. And this is notable because a number of students actually wanted Franklin Murphy, as Chancellor of UCLA, to write a telegram to Robert Kennedy, who is US Attorney General, and Ross Barnett, the segregationist governor of Mississippi. And his quote at the bottom shows the tension between Franklin Murphy and his position as Chancellor, but also not being the final decision maker for for UCLA through Clark Kerr. And he says, "I cannot authorize my name as a signatory to the protest telegrams in spite of my personal sympathy for our students who were arrested in Jackson." That's Franklin Murphy. In spite of his personal sympathy. The student vote eventually, the students voted in favor of using the bill, but a formal committee overturned that decision and did not use student government funds to bail those students, to support those students' bail funds in Mississippi. But Franklin Murphy ultimately made the decision and made a personal donation toward those students supporting their cause and coming up with funds for bail. This is notable because we don't often think about how organizational charts and hierarchy within university systems actually stall progress, right? So think about Franklin Murphy, a chancellor who was sympathetic to the Black freedom movement, who wanted to support within all power as chancellor, the Black freedom movement and students and the freedom riders. But because of the university system setup with Clark Kerr as the president and the board of regents, Franklin Murphy did not have the full authority that he was concerned with having even before accepting the job. And this is a really rich history that gives us a lot to think about today when we think about decision-making within higher education. So as I wrap up, I just want to sort of bring up this question of the campus color line today, bringing it full circle from the contemporary historical and coming back to the contemporary. There are some really pertinent, urgent questions to be asked around gentrification and perpetuating housing discrimination and the role of higher education in doing so. And what do we see university leaders, chancellors and presidents' involvement with those decisions, even at the federal level? And what does it mean around federal policy around housing, universities? This is a long-standing history, but it's not a sort of passive, just happens. These are decisions being actively made. So that's one thing. Another thing to consider about organizational structures, what about new people within the same systems, right? When we talk about systemic problems, right? Systemic racism and higher education perpetuating that. What does it mean that you may have not interchangeable, but you may have new people moving to these positions, but also if they're operating within the same old systems, how much change do we actually see, right? The same question around sort of the university and their very public statements today, right? I think about how many institutions had public statements around George Floyd or Breonna Taylor and being in shock and now saying Black Lives Matter. But at the same time, what does it mean about having the same old university decision-making processes in place that we've seen for 50, 60, 70 years? And what does that mean? And then finally, this idea of reckoning with the past, but also including the immediate past, right? I think about Craig Stephen Wilder's book that looks at the history of slavery in higher education and how many institutions in response to that work have stopped to form commissions and formal length studies around this idea of grappling with this history. But those studies don't typically move into the more immediate past, right? What I demonstrate in the book are issues from the 1950s and 1960s and relevant to the 1970s, to where some of those people may still be affiliated with these institutions, and we're not grappling with that more immediate past, especially when we think about the questions around policing in general, but campus policing, because this era that the University of Chicago and urban renewal and displacing Black families is also closely related to when they started to build out on a large scale the University of Chicago police as well. So with that said, let's get into a conversation. I love to welcome your questions, any discussion. And I just want to also acknowledge that all of the travel that went into one of these different archives, National Academy of Education, Spencer Foundation, Woodrow Wilson Foundation, University of Chicago itself, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Princeton University were all supportive in doing this work. So thank you, and let's talk.
Yeah, let's get to it. Let's get in it. Let's get some. That was really awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Cole. As you mentioned, we do have some questions here. And so we'd like to invite you to share your questions in the chat. And just to get us going as people get, moving and processing, I'm sure they're like a crock pot. They're on simmer. They got to digest all that you just put on the plate. But here's one where we can just start off.
Yeah.
You mentioned that, there has been some conflict, some tensions. And one of the questions we received prior to your talk from interested parties about and queries about today's event was, what strategies for conflict resolution do you have in terms of what might be most fruitful, particularly when faculty meet resistance from administration when they're trying to go about creating transformative change? And then there was a two-parter. The second part was, what do you see, if any, is the role of white women in allyship?
Yeah. Great question. Way to get us started. Let's get right into it. So first thing, one thing about the strategy for faculty, but I'm also going to expand that question out to students, student activists as well who want to see change, some strategies. One thing that I've been saying a lot lately is you've got to, when you get resistance from administrators, you've got to continue to find a way to continue the conversation, right? And so one particular instance is, I'm so concerned about this moment we're in right now, 2020 coming into 2021, is that what happens when something else comes up and the issue moves on, and we never addressed all the issues from 2020. And so oftentimes you see that sort of resistance, sort of this sort of pause, let's think about it, let's get into a committee work, let's do all those sort of things. But in reality, it is so essential to find a way to have sustained pressure and sustained conversations with administrators. And so sometimes what that means is being willing to build a coalition among faculty, students, and so forth, that you can pass on where the conversation left off. Because you know how sometimes, and I'm sure many of us on this conversation can relate to this, sometimes you start something and you run out of energy on it, like you just don't have it right now, and the conversation kind of stops right there. It kind of fades off right there. You want to have a strategy in place to where when you get tired, when it's time to pass it on to somebody else, they keep it going just like that. And that's what the historical record demonstrates for us, is that when we see instances of change in higher education, we've seen this sort of passing of the baton, if you will, from one person to the next person, or from one group to the next group, that continues the conversation and keeps it on the forefront of administrators' minds. And so I would say that's one of the more critical strategies, I think, that's so applicable to us right now, is that the problems in front of us right now are going to take a lot of work, right? People have been working on them for years, and we're going to have to continue to work on them for years. What we're going to have to do is keep this sort of this broader holistic conversation going to where we can pass it on to the next wave. And then when administrators change, right, you keep the conversations going, right? Just like when faculty move about, or when students graduate and move about, you keep that conversation going. So that's one thing. And then the role of white women in allyship. I mean, one thing is you've got to be willing to acknowledge your own bias, the way you perpetuated racism, racist structures. You got to be able to sort of take that self-inventory right now and just be real about it, because you can't get out and just immediately. It's just one of those things, like you got to do the self-reflection, right, and get on board, because the issues that you as a potential ally are just coming into light with, right? That you want to be a part of, that you feel inspired to be a part of right now, these issues aren't new, right? And so for that to be the case, you got to study the history and understanding the history of where these issues have come from. And then in the process, hopefully you're reflecting on your role in how things have gotten to the point where they are. And that way you're really to have more meaningful engagement in the moment right now. So that's sort of my immediate thoughts on that one.
Okay, thanks for that.
Yeah.
Cole, we have a question that's come in terms of one of our attendees says, I'm curious about presidents at community colleges
Mm-hmm.
and how they have or have not responded to racial issues. Are there authors or other resources you can point me to so I can learn more about the role of community college presidents specifically?
Oh, that's a great question. So I actually speak with a good number of community colleges right now. So one, I can kick it back to you, Ebony, on the community college leaderships. Who's doing the work right now, and what's very real. But also want to give a shout out to the Wheelhouse Center at the University of California, Davis, that also brings together a group of community colleges across the nation, and specifically it's a leadership center for community college leaders. And they've got a number of briefs and resources on the Wheelhouse Center at UC Davis that gives a good insight into how current community colleges right now are grappling with the issues of race in higher education. Because even though this is historical in nature, this is something that is so applicable to any level. I mean, it doesn't matter what size institution you lead, whether you are, a community college, four-year institution, or a standalone professional or graduate institute. Like all these leaders, if you're in the president or chancellor role, serious issues are happening right now that you have got to address. And so people are out there doing the work. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks so much for that. Another question is, can you talk about Black presidents who understood their work as dismantling segregation?
Yeah. I got a good example in the book about Martin Jenkins, who was the president of Morgan State College at the time, and now Morgan State University in Baltimore. Was president there from 1948 to 1970. And that's a good example of someone who completely understood that their role as president was to dismantle racist systems. And Martin Jenkins isn't discussed as often, to be frank, when we think about some of the college presidents during this era, during this time frame. But Martin Jenkins went to Howard University in the early 1920s for undergrad, and went on to Indiana State Teachers College at the time for a second bachelor's degree in education, and then went to Northwestern University up in Evanston for both his master's and PhD in education, and started studying gifted education, particularly Black students in gifted education, and was a polished survey researcher. And what he was doing is started consulting for different cities and different states, ultimately ended up doing about 22 states in the US, and trying to challenge how we even thought about gifted education, and really got into this idea around how testing in schools was racially biased. One of the earlier people to point about that. And so ultimately moving through his faculty career, where he's a faculty member at Howard and taking the presidency at Morgan State, something that Martin Jenkins was clear about in both his both formal role as president, but also personally hidden behind closed doors. Well, how do you challenge these systems, right? And one particular thing was testifying in desegregation cases, right? We don't think about Black college presidents in the historical record giving expert opinions before the Senate Judiciary Committee, but Martin Jenkins did that, right? Also testified in federal court for other reasons for Arlington, Virginia desegregation questions about that, and challenged this idea of separate but equal, right? And was at Howard, when they were at Howard University, when the NAACP legal team was preparing for the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and was consulting in those conversations around education as well. And so you see these sort of networks among college presidents that it weren't necessarily given these sort of public-facing efforts in this sort of traditional way that University of Chicago people are in the New York Times. Not like that, but you still see Black college presidents actively understanding that their work is to challenge segregation.
Thank you so much. There's a question in terms of how do you deal with administrators who want to change, right? So that you have some activist leadership, but they don't necessarily see that in their faculty. So you have faculty who refuse to change in lieu of there being administrators that want to push for change, as the faculty may stand behind the AAUP and so forth, so that they don't have to change. So it's a bit of a statement, I guess, as much as it is a question, but do you have any thoughts or comments relative to that tension of, the faculty body, the instructional core being stagnant in lieu of having a leader that wants to transform?
Yeah, it's two examples in the book that talks about how presidents were able to work with faculty in very interesting, productive ways. And one is being able to have the ongoing conversation with faculty, right? As a leader, being able to continually meet with faculty and see where faculty stand on issues, but also not have that be a one-off, right? And so one particular thing at the University of Alabama in 1962, this is a year before Vivian Malone and James Hood were enrolled as Black students on that campus, before the infamous stand in the schoolhouse door by Governor George Wallace. In 62, the president started meeting with faculty and going to faculty meetings and actually listening to faculty and laying out why the change was necessary for the long-term well-being of the institution. And that sort of work, that collaboration together and sort of being strategic, right? Putting the interests of the university, right? This sort of gets me into Derek Bell and interest conversions, right? This gets into this idea of how can desegregation both be beneficial to the university for thriving and surviving and continue to function as an accredited institution, but also, be within compliance with federal law and not being discriminatory, right? And so one thing is being able to have these meetings with faculty. That's so critical, and being able to lay out just the benefit, not just for the university, but also the benefit to the faculty. That's one thing. And then another example in the book is for the administrators who are facing resistance, is that to be able to have your personal moral understanding of what you feel is right, to be aligned with your professional obligations as an administrator, right? The most effective leaders in history are those people where those two things were aligned. Because oftentimes you see, I'm thinking about a particular example out of LSU right now, or Oregon State / LSU, what we see in the news right now today around the president and the question around major college football and what decisions should have been made. But listening to that example, you see where a chancellor or president says, I felt one way personally, but professionally, I was limited in what I could do. And so you have to be able to take the risk professionally and say, this is just what I stand for. This is just what I believe in. And if you don't believe in that as an institution, then you don't believe in me or need me as a leader. And that's sort of the risk you have to take to create change.
Mm-hmm. Conviction, integrity, authentic leadership, right? Stepping beyond those statements.
Yep.
Stepping into some action steps, right?
Absolutely.
So we have a question about how do you view leaders of color today? Or how do you feel that young folks actually consider and hold leaders of color?
Well, how do I view leaders of color?
Mm-hmm. How do you perceive that young folk are viewing our leaders of color today?
Oh yeah, well, this is that's probably one of those impossible answers because it's so broad. I mean, the leadership just varies across so many. Wait, look, for clarity, you're talking about administrators of color? How do young people view administrators of color, or how do I view young leaders of color?
The question was framed as, how do you perceive the young folks,
Okay.
Their view of leaders of color? It didn't specify administrators per se, but leaders of color.
Yeah. No. This is the beauty of studying history, because change has consistently been pushed from the youth, and so I really appreciate the assertiveness, the directness, the excitement, the energy that comes from young people right now and their push, and they continue to hold leaders accountable. leaders of color included. And so I think that's spot on. If we're going to see change, if we're going to actually see change and see these universities live up to what the public statements say the universities want to live up to, then it's time for us to sort of stop, pause, and listen to what young leaders are doing right now. I mean, this is just some remarkable work that we're seeing, and just how they're able to connect and use so many different platforms to take a movement not only beyond their campus, but across time zones, across the world. This is so critical right now. And look, something serious that we're going to see change. It's just going to be a minute, but we're going to see change. The way we think about policing on college campuses and university police departments, that is going to seriously change ultimately. And the only reason it's going to change is because young people are pushing right now for accountability.
This question asks, I wonder if you could speak more about how to approach building a relationship with new leadership while also sustaining the advocacy that has been engaged in and with the previous administration.
Yeah. This is why transitions are so notable. And so before the current leadership leaves office, retires, move on to the next place, that's a good time to sort of also sit down and get some understanding of where things stand between the outgoing leadership, and then immediately sit down with the incoming leadership, right? Because what many of us in higher education know is that there's an onboarding process. Doesn't matter where you are in the university, what your position is, you go through an onboarding process and you're given some basic information that's pertinent to your position. So if you're an incoming chancellor, incoming president, incoming dean, vice president, you're also going through this onboarding process. What you want to do, is to keep sustaining your efforts, is be part of that onboarding process or be in conversation with new leaders shortly after they come on board. That's going to be absolutely critical, because if you let it get, 3-4 months down the road, then all of a sudden there's an onboarding process that has happened, and then you're trying to catch them up after they've already been caught up.
I hear you. So kind of a follow-up to that is, how do you deal with administrators who want to change, but they also don't recognize their privilege and status? How do you think about and have them reflect on self-interest and self-preservation in contrast to cultural investments and moving away from interest that is more so along the lines of sustaining status quo?
I'll share this. Some contemporary presidents, some contemporary leaders who lead institutions that are mentioned in the book, and this is just my fortunate opportunity that I've actually picked up the phone and talked to some of them. And I won't get into naming who they were, but a consistent theme among some of these presidents has been that they learned something new about their own institutions from reading the book. And that's less about me talking about the book, and more about me saying that a lot of contemporary leaders aren't fully abreast of history, right? They understand the sort of broader institutional history of their universities. They sort of know the big stuff, founding date and land grant and that sort of stuff, but they don't really understand the social history of their institutions. And I think when we get more leaders to seriously grapple with history, to seriously better understand the social history of their institution, that means they've learned the people's history of their institution. And when they learn the people's history, they'll realize that their position is extremely influential, and their position has both done good and some bad within this position. But when you know that history, that's going to make you much more reflective on your current leadership and making sure that your legacy is one that you'd be happy to see in the history book.
All right. Well, we are getting close to time, and got one more, and this one is quite thought-provoking. Starts with a statement: the white lash has been and continues to be strong, and the legal advice university administrators get is lacking. So academic leadership has not changed their perspectives and what it means to lead, despite their public statements. Black and Indigenous and other people of color, in terms of faculty and students, continue to deal with violence that is particularly severe against women and the John Henryism that results. Question: what we see is that nothing changes, and what strategies do you think are critical for changing administrative responses in the face of white lash and their legal counsel so that they can be leaders that are bold and that act?
You know, that's that's a heavy wrap-up question. You know, that's a big one. What strategies would I have for leaders to lead boldly in the face of white lash or backlash? That's interesting. You know, here's what's so critical right now, what I say for leaders, is that you've got to have this sort of energy behind your leadership, in that you want to create the culture where everybody thrives. And you've got to move out of the safe model, the formula of previous leaders, right? The climate we're in right now is has bubbled into something really that your predecessors didn't quite have to engage with on the same level. I mean, this is a critical moment. And so for us to get leaders who are willing to step beyond the usual and willing to step out front despite backlash, you're going to have them sort of reckon with where we are in this moment and sort of take that self reflection around what impact and legacy they want to have. I mean, that's going to be absolutely essential. And so if you want to step out of the side of the status quo, then you really solidifying your legacy as something special, something unique, and something transformative. Because otherwise, you're just in the position, but you're not of the position, creating the change. And history demonstrates that people in these positions of leadership have a tremendous power to shape racial policies and practices. And so you should use that power responsibly.
Now that's the last word, and this is a good place for us to wrap up. And as we see in the chat with many of the panelists, they have said, thank you, sir. Great discussion and a timely text that you have. Again, we want to say thank you so much for attending. We appreciate that you have lots of time on your hands, not so much, right? That's the commodity we could all use more of, but the fact that you spent time with us and Dr. Cole is much appreciated. Again, we see from this talk why Dr. Cole is a decorated and very distinguished scholar who is doing great work in terms of knowledge contributions. And in fact, is a 2021 Scholar of the Year as named by Education Week, one of the top university-based scholars who is, again, doing a lot to shape the educational discourse in our policy and practice. On behalf of our Dean, James Anderson, the College of Education here at the University of Illinois, our Dean's Faculty Fellow, Dr. Rodney Hobson, and myself on behalf of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, thank you so much for, again, a distinguished lecture. Good food for thought. And thank you all who've attended, and hope that you have a spark from today's conversations whereby you step beyond mere statements and step into action. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.